American colonies decided that the government of the King George III of England was taxing the colonies unfairly and without proper representation. The colonies had written and signed the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776, yet the colonies were not officially independent until Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown on October 19, 1781.
John Locke, born 1632 to 1704, was an English physician and philosopher. Known as the father of classical liberalism, he was one of the most influential of Enlightenment thinkers. His theory of mind talked about identity and self. His work greatly influenced people like Rousseau and Voltaire. He had theories on religious tolerance, Constitution of Carolina, theory of value and property, political theory, and limits to accumulation and monetary thoughts. George Washington, born 1732 to 1799, was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. He was the first president of the United States and one of the founding fathers. He was hailed as the father of the country during his lifetime and beyond. His leadership established many forms of government during the Revolutionary War. His morale held troops together in unity. His patriotism will always be remembered. Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers were John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and George Washington. The First Continental Congress met, and then the second one did too, having mutual members. But the Founding Fathers were the people who basically shaped the laws and rules of the new country and will always be remembered, like the monuments they have. Common Sense. It was a pamphlet first published anonymously by Thomas Paine in the beginning of the Revolutionary War. It was a major success and was the largest sale and circulation in all American history of a book. People were still very undecided at that time about the independence, but the pamphlet persuaded them to get off British rule and get to independence. He connected it to the Bible cleverly, writing it as a sermon and using biblical references. Controversial British legislation. Quartering Act, allowing British troops to live with colonists and take their supplies. Sugar Act, placed tax on sugar. Stamp Act, all legal and commercial documents needed a stamp to show that had been paid for. Townshend Acts, series of acts on random stuff like glass, paper, lead, paint, and tea. Writs of assistance allowed search warrants for the British to enter homes in search of smuggled goods. Intolerable Acts, a series of laws passed by Parliament to punish Massachusetts colony and served as a warning to other colonies, called coercive acts by the British. One of these acts closed the port of Boston until all destroyed tea was paid for. Declaratory Act, passed by Parliament, had right to govern the colonies. British mercantilism system. Under this system, the colonies were expected to help Great Britain get a favorable balance of trade. The colonies were supposed to have many exports and supplies. In return, they would have a government to rule and protect them. In 1651, the Navigation Acts were passed. Townshend Acts and Tea Act. The Townshend Acts were a series of acts passed by Parliament. 5 laws were often mentioned: the Revenue Act of 1767, the Indemnity Act, the Commissioners of Customs Act, the Vice Admiralty Court Act, and the New York Restraining Act. The purpose was to raise revenue in the colonies to pay the salaries of governors and judges. Townshend Acts were met with resistance in the colonies, resulting in the occupation of Boston by British troops in 1768, which led to the Boston Massacre of 1770. Most of the new taxes were repealed, but the tax on tea wasn't. The British government continued to try to tax colonists without their agreement, and the Boston Tea Party and American Revolution followed soon. King George III. He was the King of Britain, and he suffered from a recurring and eventually permanent mental disease, and his reign was longer than the others, but with many military conflicts. His reputation in the United States was known as a tyrant, but in Great Britain he was known as a scapegoat for the failing of imperialism.
Loyalists were American colonists who remained loyal to the Kingdom of Great Britain during the American Revolutionary War. They were opposed by the Patriots, who supported the revolution. About one-fifth of the European American population remained loyal to Great Britain, firmly rejecting independence. Most Loyalists had one thing in common. They had long opposed the men who became Patriot leaders, though for varying reasons. During the war, Loyalists congregated in cities held by the British Army. When those posts were evacuated at war's end, Loyalists scattered to different parts of the British Empire, Britain, the West Indies, and especially Canada. In the provinces of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Ontario, they recreated their lives as colonists, laying the foundations of British Canada. All told, perhaps as many as 100,000 Americans preferred to leave their homeland rather than live in a nation independent of British rule. Between the Patriots and the Loyalists, there remained in the middle perhaps two-fifths of the European American population. Some of those who tried to avoid taking sides were sincere pacifists such as Quakers. Others opportunistically shifted their allegiance to whatever side happened to be winning at the time. Still, others simply wanted to be left alone. They cared little about politics and usually obeyed whoever was in power. Such colonists also resisted British and Americans alike when the demands on them seemed too heavy, when taxes became too high, for example, or when calls for militia service came too often. Women contributed to the American Revolution in many ways and were involved on both sides. They participated by boycotting British goods, spying on the British, following armies as they marched, washing, cooking, and tending for soldiers, delivering secret messages, and in a few cases, like Deborah Sampson, fighting disguised as men. A woman named Mercy Otis Warren held meetings in her house and cleverly attacked Loyalists with her creative plays and stories. Women had to return to knitting goods and to spinning their own cloth, skills that had fallen into disuse. In 1769, the women of Boston produced 40,000 skeins of yarn, and 180 women in Middletown, Massachusetts wove 20,522 yards of cloth. The Battle of Lexington and Concord took place April 19, 1775, when the British sent a force of roughly 1,000 troops to confiscate arms and arrest revolutionaries in Concord, Massachusetts. They clashed with the local militia, marking the first fighting of the American Revolutionary War. Then the news aroused the 13 colonies to call out their militias and send troops to besiege Boston. The Battle of Bunker Hill followed on June 17, 1775. Well, British victory, it was all great cost. About 1,000 British casualties from a garrison of about 6,000 as compared to 500 American casualties from a much larger force. The Second Continental Congress assembled in 1775 after the war began. The Congress created the Continental Army and extended the Olive Branch Petition to the Crown as an attempt at reconciliation. King George III refused to receive it, issuing instead the Proclamation of Rebellion, requiring action against the traitors. In the winter of 1775, Americans invaded Canada. General Richard Montgomery captured Montreal but put a joint attack on Quebec with the help of Benedict Arnold. It failed. George Washington became a commander of a new army in March 1776 and forced the British to evacuate Boston. The revolutionaries were now in full control of all 13 colonies and ready to declare independence. After the surrender at Saratoga in October 1777, there were thousands of British and Hessian soldiers in American hands. Therefore, no Americans were put on trial for treason. The British mistreated the prisoners they held, resulting in more deaths to American sailors and soldiers than combat operations. At the end of the war, both sides released surviving prisoners. Britain's war against the Americans, French and Spanish, cost about $100 million. The Treasury borrowed 40% of the money it needed. Heavy spending brought France to the verge of bankruptcy and revolution, while the British had relatively little difficulty financing their war, keeping their suppliers and soldiers paid, and hiring tens of thousands of German soldiers. After Washington forced the British out of Boston in spring 1776, neither the British nor the Loyalists controlled any significant areas. A delegation including John Adams and Benjamin Franklin met Howe on Staten Island in New York Harbor on September 11th in what became known as the Staten Island Peace Conference. Howe demanded a retraction of the Declaration of Independence, which was refused, and negotiations ended until 1781. The British then quickly seized New York City and nearly captured General Washington. They made the city their main political and military base of operations in North America, holding it until November 1783. The British also took New Jersey, pushing the Continental Army into Pennsylvania. In a surprise attack in late December 1776, Washington crossed the Delaware River back into New Jersey and defeated Hessian and British armies at Trenton and Princeton, thereby regaining again New Jersey. In 1777, as part of a grand strategy to end the war, the British sent an invasion force from Canada to seal off New England, which the British perceived as the primary source of agitators. In a major case of miscoordination, the British Army in New York City went to Philadelphia, which it captured from Washington. The invasion army under Burgoyne waited in vain for reinforcements from New York and became trapped in northern New York State. It surrendered after the Battle of Saratoga in October 1777. From early October 1777 until November 15th, a pivotal siege at Fort Mifflin, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, distracted the British troops and allowed Washington time to preserve the Continental Army by safely leading his troops to harsh winter quarters at Valley Forge. The capture of a British army at Saratoga encouraged the French to formally enter the war in support of Congress, as Benjamin Franklin negotiated a permanent military alliance in early 1778, significantly becoming the first country to officially recognize the Declaration of Independence. On February 6, 1778, a Treaty of Amity and Commerce and a Treaty of Alliance were signed between the United States and France. William Pitt spoke out in Parliament urging Britain to make peace in America and unite with America against France, while other British politicians who had previously sympathized with the colonial grievances now turned against the American rebels for allying with British international rival and enemy. Later, Spain in 1779 and the Dutch 1780 became allies of the French, leaving the British Empire to fight a global war alone without major allies and requiring it to slip through a combined blockade of the Atlantic. Because of the alliance with France and the deteriorating military situation, Sir Henry Clinton, the British commander, evacuated Philadelphia to reinforce New York City. General Washington attempted to intercept the retreating column, resulting in the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, the last major battle fought in the North. After an inconclusive engagement, the British successfully retreated to New York City. The Northern War subsequently became a stalemate, as the focus of the attention shifted to the smaller Southern theater. The British Army under Cornwallis marched to Yorktown, Virginia, where they expected to be rescued by a British fleet. The fleet showed up, but so did a larger French fleet, so the British fleet, after the Battle of the Chesapeake, returned to New York for reinforcements, leaving Cornwallis trapped. In October 1781, under a combined siege by the French and Continental armies under Washington, the British surrendered, their second invading army of the war. The peace treaty with Britain, known as the Treaty of Paris, gave the U.S. all land east of the Mississippi River and south of the Great Lakes. Though not including Florida, on September 3, 1783, Britain entered into a separate agreement with Spain under which Britain ceded Florida back to Spain. The British abandoned the Indian allies living in this region. They were not a party to this treaty and did not recognize it until they were defeated by the United States militarily. Issues regarding boundaries and depths were not resolved until the Jay Treaty of 1795. Since the blockade was lifted and the old imperial restrictions were gone, American merchants were free to trade with any nation anywhere in the world, and their businesses flourished. That loss of the American colonies enabled Britain to deal with the French Revolution with more unity and better organization than would otherwise have been the case.